Dr. Ben is on the other coast. He's on the West Coast. So how have you been? How being an intern tiring?
It's been pretty good so far. It's really busy, as you may expect, with COVID and everything like that. But things are starting to settle down, and I'm really glad to be able to have some time to come talk with you guys today.
I'm glad. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Someone said the West Coast, best coast. I'd like to
I'm still partial
disagree
towards
with
the
that.
East Coast.
I asked Dr. Ben to come in here tonight because it is med school application season soon. And I know so many people have questions about the whole process and just the whole journey, pre-med journey and medical school journey and residency journey. And there's no other person to hear but from someone who just finished the whole process. Dr. Ben, if you could please introduce yourself to us.
Thank you very much for having me. So my name is Ben Tran. I'm a current intern going into dermatology. I recently graduated from University of Virginia, which is actually on the East Coast, in 2020. So my kind of journey, I went to undergrad at the same institution, decided to go to medicine, took a gap year, and was really glad to take that gap year. Then went to medical school, and then here I am. On the side, I'm also the CEO and co-founder of ShadowDoc, which is a e-learning platform in which we try to really show students what it's like to be a medical professional before they go into the field. Because I feel like a lot of students don't really know what it's like, and then suddenly they're a pre-med, and then suddenly they're taking like 50,000 classes, and then it's really nice to get that kind of experience before you go in and jump in.
I can imagine. What inspired you to go into medicine? Is there anyone in the family or?
Yeah, so not really. My parents were both in the business field, and
Mm.
then actually my sister became a physician assistant. That was coinciding with the time that I was starting to become a pre-med. So no one was in the medical field yet, but it was really just motivating myself to do it.
Wow, so you're the first physician in the family line then.
Yeah, so far. Hopefully not the last, but
Hopefully not the last. I know, I know. It's such a long process going through the whole medical route. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of pressure for sure, a lot of strength that and a lot of money as well. So I guess our plan for tonight is to just tackle like each step you've gone through and hopefully that people can learn from it, especially pre-med and med students. Let's talk about your undergrad journey first. How was that? What did you major in? And how was the whole journey of 4 years studying your everything to get into medical school?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I came into undergrad. I thought I was pre-med and like knew I was kind of pre-med, so I kind of knew that from the get-go. You know, the high school studying methods are really different and they don't really work in college. We learned that quickly and I learned that hard way maybe quickly. But I initially came in, I wanted to do like a biology major, which is pretty
Mm.
typical. And then I ultimately decided to actually pursue neuroscience. So that
Wow.
was, I was really fascinated by the brain. So I wanted to become a neurosurgeon. I think Grey's Anatomy probably had a little bit to do with that.
For sure.
Uh, and then my first and 2 years, like that's where I was like really trying to get my bearings in terms of how to study and everything. And then my second year, I decided to do the neuroscience major. And all along this, I feel like there's a lot of check boxes that pre-meds feel like they have
Mm.
to do when they're in undergrad. I feel like, there's research, there's volunteering, there's all these other things. You
Same.
have to get a good grade. And there's
Yeah.
so many different things. And I felt like I was just checking off all these boxes. Unfortunately, to some degree, there is some part of that that's required for med school. But I went through undergrad doing all those things. I volunteered in the hospital. I started research when I was a first year and continued it throughout when I was a fourth year. And really liked it a lot and really found research to be pretty motivating and really, really interesting. And then I took my MCAT and did okay, just okay, good enough. And then eventually was able to graduate. But we could break down those more into, like what are the extracurriculars and stuff like that,
Mhm.
if that's interesting.
Yeah. So was your research also on neuroscience during your third and fourth year?
Yeah, so I started doing infectious disease research actually. I was
Oh.
studying anthrax, and I really thought that was really cool because I really wanted to see the interface between the brain and infectious disease. So I
Mhm.
studied neuroscience, infectious disease, and then I swiveled a little bit over from a different disease, which is, and I studied a neural parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. It's actually the
Mhm.
reason why pregnant females are not supposed to interact with cat litter because
Mhm.
it could cause this neural parasite that goes on to the
Yeah.
baby. So most of my stuff was all in infectious disease and neuroscience.
It's interesting how you didn't end up in infectious disease specialty as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. The things that we were interested in before slowly evolved, but yeah.
For sure. And neuroscience, still deep, heavy, upper level sciences. I think a common question amongst pre-med or coming out of high school is what major should someone be to be on the pre-medical route? I know there's non-conventional ones. I know someone who got into medical school having an art history major and they just took the prereqs on the side. But for you, what do you think is the best, or I guess the good majors that they can integrate medical school with?
Yeah, sure. So I think that it was interesting because when I was a pre-med student in college, I thought the same thing. I thought like, I need to do a science major because that shows I'm dedicated to the field. And to some degree, it helps with kind of the upper level bios as you're showing that you're doing some sort of major in that. But there's no true one, two different majors I recommend. Honestly, after going through everything, after seeing my friends in medical school, after, doing all those things, I found that everyone has their own different interests. So the best thing is that for students to find a major that they're passionate about, because that could get you better grades, and then better grades will get you into the medical school. Because if you do a bio major and you're not really passionate about it and you end up with not as good academics, it just does you a disservice in the end. So really focusing on something that you're passionate about. And the one best thing about medical schools or medical school applicants and pre-meds and also English majors probably is that we're really good at spinning things. So like if you find out that you major in English or something like that, you can take that critical analysis and say, I love to, do critical analysis of my patients and their histories and really get to know them better through that. And I learned that from my character analyses of these books, et cetera, et cetera. So like you can really spin any sort of major to be good for medical school.
Yeah, and I guess also that's why during medical school applications, they try to really look for a holistic applicant, right? Who's not just, who doesn't seem just like a robot, who's all sciences and nothing else, right? So someone actually asked, sent in a question of what was your most favorite class during undergrad and which was the one that you hated the most?
I think that my most favorite class was actually astrology class, or it was like a physics class, I think. So it was called Unsolved Mysteries of the Universe. And like in it, we talked about like time travel, is it real? How can it be done? Wormholes, like are there aliens? And then we went through like the different Fermi's like paradox, and that was something that my brain wasn't used to whatsoever, because mine was just like engineering, memorize these biochemistry things, and then this sort of abstractness was really fun. The class I probably liked the least was honestly like general chemistry.
Me too.
And it's kind of it's funny because did you not like it at all either? But yeah,
my mind is just thinking about moles.
Yeah. It's like how many of these things can come out of the reaction. But I found it really not that interesting to me personally. And then what we find in medical school is that none of these classes that we take are useful in medical school. The only one that's moderately useful is like biochem, because you take that in the first typically 1 to 2 weeks in medical school. But after that, you don't take any of these science classes. Which is why they should probably revamp the MCAT, but that's a different topic.
I wish. And someone asked, did you like Orgo?
Sure, yeah. So Orgo is surprisingly pretty fun. I think it's dependent upon the professors and the culture. So at some academic institutions for college, working with classmates is kind of difficult because everyone's really competitive. Everyone doesn't want to work together. They're all like me versus you mentality. And it's really not that great. But at my school, it was pretty fun. Our teachers and professors were very nice. Everyone kind of got along together. And it was like putting the pieces together for the puzzle for working backwards from a biochemical reaction. Unfortunately, it's like similar to many things in science. If you don't remember it and you don't know it, there's no way to logically reason it out. You're kind of stuck staring at that piece of paper.
I know. That's it. Yeah, it like flies out the window afterwards. Like, especially after one semester and then you try to revisit it. That's why I feel like people spend so much time on content review for the MCAT, right? Because it's been like years since you've seen those concepts. But do you have any studying tips like for the undergrad level for those who are pre-med?
Yeah, sure. So this is really going to be dependent upon the different course. So for physics and for biochem, for example, and for chemistry, it's all going to be about the practice questions. And so that's really what it boils down to. And this is just like repetition of those questions, even if it's not commonly recommended to just do those questions, because that's most likely what's going to be on your exam. It depends whether or not the professor actually likes those questions or if he likes taking questions from his PowerPoint. So being familiar with that is really important. Along that note, it's great because when you first come in, you should really make some friends with like upper levels, because they've gone through it. Like what we're doing now, we're talking about someone
and they have resources.
and the resources. And just to get a better better sense of like, hey, does that professor typically base off this
Yeah.
exam mostly off the PowerPoints or is it off the book? And so
Yeah.
getting that understanding is really important for anybody that's
Yeah,
going
I
into
agree with
it.
you though. Like it's very individualized as well, how someone studies or how someone grasps a content as well. But obviously, you did great.
Did
You
okay,
went through
just
medical
well
school.
enough.
You did great for sure. And like you said earlier as well, the whole medical school journey or prior to medical school is just checking off the boxes. You have your grades, you have your classes, and you have every other things that you need for your application, like shadowing, clinical experience, volunteer. Can you tell us about your experiences, like what you did for clinicals or shadowing specifically?
Sure, sure. So I'll break it up kind of in the timeline that we approach it. So like shadowing is typically a little bit later, but volunteering is something that we really recommend commonly for students who want to go apply to med school. We separate it into clinical volunteering versus non-clinical. That's like the most easiest separation in our minds. And so beginning with the clinical volunteering, these are things that you're typically doing in the hospital, like patient transport, stocking shelves, helping in the ED to help patients, like, you know, if they need a cup of water or if they need some sort of patient contact representative to help and be that interface. So these are really common ones. It's a little bit harder if you don't have a hospital system attached to your undergrad. But if there is, I would really recommend students to get involved that way. They'll quickly find that some of the experiences are a little bit less meaningful than others, meaning that if you're really extroverted and you really like meeting people, and you're sitting in a stocking room, stocking shelves all day, it's not going to feel meaningful at that time. And I encourage you to find something else that's a little bit a different opportunity, but still in the hospital system. But sometimes you could just do that for a year and then quickly switch over to something else. The other thing is the non-clinical volunteering. So this is something that we recommend students to do and try to get a leadership position in, because that's something that we look forward to in students. And the leadership positions could be varied. They could be like vice president, the presidents, or some sort of head of the chair. But I recommend students to do this is going to be kind of against the grain, but I recommend they actually do something that they actually like, which is surprising. Like you would want to use your time to do something that you like. And it's nice because it makes you stand out from the rest of the crowd. So like when we see applicants or like medical school admissions committees would see applicants, they would see someone who is applying to medical school, seems like a robot on paper until they see like, oh, they really like to walk dogs and they do that like 5 times. And like, that's really interesting. And it makes us have a conversation starter and hopefully it's interesting for the applicant. And then going into the shadowing question. So shadowing is hard during COVID, understandably so. Before, back in the day, it still used to be pretty hard because you would have to blindly email like a bunch of professors like, hey, can I shadow? Can I shadow? And that's already like one roadblock. The students who don't have connections find a lot of difficulty with that. And I hope that some undergrad institutions are providing resources or connections to mediate that. But typically, in the most common theme throughout all of it so far was like, you don't need that many shadowing hours. Like, you only need up to like maybe 30 to 50. Beyond 50, you're kind of just like, you've seen a lot of it. Anything else is kind of just superfluous and extra that you don't necessarily need, and your time could be better spent studying for the MCAT or improving other areas of your application.
Speaking of shadowing, you are the CEO of Shadow.Med. Can you please tell us about that?
Yeah, sure, sure. So Shadow Doc started off because we recognize that there is just this deficit in ability for students to reach out to doctors to find shadowing opportunities. And so we quickly found that we could try to be the medium for that and help students navigate that. So if they were in a town that they didn't have a neurosurgeon in, and that was their dream, that was their passion, we could help find our network of physicians to be able to get them a shadowing experience with them. Since the COVID pandemic has occurred, we've had to navigate a lot of changes.
I know.
Yeah, no one's going into the hospital as much anymore. So we've quickly turned into a virtual e-learning platform. And so in these courses that we do offer, we offer a variety of different specialties like dermatology, emergency medicine, quickly orthopedics, and like infectious disease. And so in these, the students can actually work alongside the physicians to try to diagnose and treat patients that are simulated, of course, given the physician kind of expertise and guidance in their decision-making process. So it's been a great learning experience for me, and hopefully a great experience for all of the students who are partaking so far.
When did you start Shadow Doc?
Yeah, so I actually started it in my 4th year of med school. So it was a little bit on the later side, but it was great because it's interestingly enough, during the 4th year of your med school, you typically have the most time. It's like the most expensive vacation we take. That's what this 4th year's med school is called.
I can imagine. That's amazing. Yeah, like you said, it's been so hard for many students students to gain shadowing opportunities. Like there's a lot of groups on Facebook for like pre-med students, and they're like, we can't find any shadowing. So they're thinking of resorting to e-shadowing. Okay, will medical schools accept it and stuff like that. So it's been hard, but it's great that you have what you're doing. At least it paves way for students to get that experience. So thank you
Yeah, of
for that.
course. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that you took a gap year, and this is something that a lot of students actually think about. So I searched it up, and AMC says that the mean age of applicants to medical school is 24 years old, which sounds really young. Stat News released an article in February where the title is Why Medical School Should Start at 28. Do you think that students should take gap years? Should students live their 20s first before entering medical school? And if so, would it be too late to start if they're like 30 or whatnot?
Sure. I think that's a really good question. And thanks for looking up those stats. Good to know them. So I interestingly thought that the average, I don't know, so the average age of applications may be 24. I don't know what the average age of matriculants is.
Yeah.
Because that's an interesting data point
Yeah.
too. It used to be commonly cited that the average age to get into medical school was like, 27. But I mean, the age maybe have been changed now. But I think honestly that gap year decisions are really personal choice. And so back in the day, like even like 5 to 7 years ago, I feel like gap years were a little bit less common. I think a lot of people frowned upon them because they thought that it represented like a failure. Like I need a gap year because I couldn't go straight through because my academics weren't good enough, my MCAT wasn't good enough. And I really think that's such a bad perspective, an unfortunate perspective to have, connotation to have gap years. I think that's why it's commonly called like a bridge year now, for example. But I think that personally, for everybody, they should really reflect on what will they do differently with this gap year? Like, will they improve their application? Do they actually want a break from, school itself? For example, I took a gap year because I wanted to improve my application in some areas. And then I also wanted to just explore the world. Like I'm only 22, 21 once. And then so I traveled throughout like Southeast Asia and I had fun. I was a medical scribe for the beginning. And then once I got into medical school, I quit my job quickly.
Oh, really? Oh.
I was like, well, I've done my dues and I left. But I
What
think
did you do exactly for your gap year?
yeah, so in the beginning, I was an orthopedic scribe, scribed for a company called Scribe America, which is a very common one. And I did that for about 6 months while I was applying to med school, doing my interviews. And then quickly, after I got in, then I left. I quit my job, got into my med school as a choice. And then I went off to Southeast Asia, and I was studying Mandarin in Taiwan. I was a bartender, really just enjoying the scene, enjoying the life that I had. Almost didn't want to come back from med school, but
I know.
Life calls.
I can imagine. So I went to Hawaii once, and I was like, I just want to stay here. I don't want to go back and go for medical school. Like, why do I have to go through this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's yeah. Wow, that's amazing though. I mean, that really contributes to like being so well-rounded, especially being in another country, another continent. Actually,
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
amazing. I hope you enjoyed the experience though.
Yeah, I did. It was really pleasant.
And was that during the time like you took the MCAT already prior to doing that?
Yeah, so I took my MCAT in between my third and fourth year of med school during the summer. And then I really spent the rest of my fourth year kind of lining up the job for my gap year and then trying to figure out my application and like letters of recommendations. For students who do take bridge years or gap years, it's really good to get the letters before you leave because once you leave, the kind of professors are like, well, out of sight, out of mind. And then when you need a letter, like a few months later, they're kind of like, who are you again? So definitely get your ducks in a row before you leave.
Yeah. And that was actually a big question. A few people sending questions about letters of recommendations. They're asking what is the way to attack asking for letters of recommendations to professors, and even like those who went back for postbacs and who's been out of school for like a few years and haven't talked to these professors for years. Like, how do you request a letter?
Yeah, it's really, yeah. So for like students who have gone through or the quote unquote traditional students, it's a little bit easier to reach out to some professors, but typically a lot of times you want to find a professor that you know. And it's hard because you're in this class of like, like 1 out of 200 maybe for Gen Chem, are you really going to approach that professor? But it's good to try to keep that in mind in the beginning of your undergrad career. Just try to be familiar with a few professors, go to a few office hours so you get to know them. If you're doing research, that research PI's
Yeah.
letter can be included.
Hmm.
And remember to look up the requirements to apply to med school. I think it used to be 2 sciences and one non-science letter.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
typically,
It's all the same. Yeah.
yeah, good, good.
Yeah.
So it's and then once you find the professor that you want to just have write your letter, just shoot them an email, try to meet with them in person. They tend to ask for like a resume or a CV or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's really important that students realize that just because they write you a letter doesn't mean it's going to be a good one. They can write you a letter that's a very, very lukewarm letter, and that really
Scary.
it doesn't help your application very
Yeah.
much. So whenever you're asking them, you should always be asking, "Can you write me a strong letter?" Because that's
Mm-hmm.
different than can you just ask me a letter. Anyone can
Mm-hmm.
get a letter and you'll be 3
Yeah.
paragraphs and sign it quickly, but
For
asking for
sure.
a strong one.
And going back to the MCAT, I know you took the old MCAT most probably,
Yeah.
right? Before
Mhm.
2015. Even though it's different, for sure, most of the material is still the same and the way you attack it is still the same. So how did you study for the MCAT?
Yeah, this is going to be also very individual based, but there's either, I kind of think about it in do I learn better independently or do I learn better in a
Mm-hmm.
formal structure? So if you learn a formal structure, then probably a course is probably going to be your best
Mm-hmm.
bet, albeit they cost anywhere from like $1,000 up. So they
Yeah.
can be kind of difficult. And even within that, that kind of branches off to should I do online learning? Should I do
Mm-hmm.
in-class learning? And
Mm-hmm.
that's really based off of which one you learn off better. So personally, for me, I learned independently. I felt like I could have learned a lot faster, and so I self-studied. I
Mm-hmm.
used resources that may or may not still be in play now, as like exam crackers and like Berkeley
So,
Review. I
yeah.
used a little bit of I think Princeton, just like
Mm-hmm.
supplemental, and
Mm-hmm.
then took a lot of practice questions. What is becoming much more prevalent now, and I really wish I had it, was like UWorld. So UWorld's been
Yeah.
huge now. They've entered the space and they've provided really good practice questions.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, I've learned that it's really good to be active learning. So active learning in Anki or Anki, however you
Yeah.
pronounce it,
Yeah.
it's a flashcard
How do
system.
you say
Is
it?
yeah, whichever one. But
Whichever one.
that's what I use in med school, and it was like honestly a
Mm-hmm.
game changer. And so I've seen a lot of students start to use that now. It does take a little bit longer to get used to, and if you want to like quickly learn it, you it's kind of difficult. But I studied for a total of 3 months using like flashcards, those things. That's why I took it during the summer.
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen students take it even like study within a shorter period of time. So it's really up to the individual and how much time they have to dedicate to MCAT study.
Yeah. And I think another scary part of the whole med school application process is interviews. How was your interview day? Were you nervous beyond words?
Yeah, yeah. So I remember my first interview. I was so scared. I was just like, "Oh my gosh! Like these are all like doctors.
Yeah,
There's medical
I know.
students, and maybe the dean of or like the head of admissions." And I was
Mm-hmm.
really, really scared.
Mm-hmm.
But after a while, and after being on the other side and going through medical school, we're all people. Like we just want
Yeah.
to get to know you. But
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't mean that you shouldn't practice, of course.
Yeah,
So
for
it's
sure.
good to know a few questions off the top of your head. Like the
Mm-hmm.
most common ones tend to be why do you want to go into medicine? Why this
Mm-hmm.
school? What
Mm-hmm.
makes you different? Or what diversity can you add to this school? And then sometimes they'll ask you like trick questions, like, or not trick questions, but more difficult questions, like testing your knowledge of or familiarity with like medical ethics. So like they'll give you an
Mm-hmm.
ethical scenario. And they'll
Mm-hmm.
just, there's no right or wrong answer, or at least there tends not to
Yeah.
be. There tends to be a very, very wrong answer, but they just want to see your kind of thought process
Mm-hmm.
behind how do you rationalize
Mm-hmm.
it. And it's hard to practice for interviews other than,
Yeah.
sitting down with somebody who's maybe gone through it or done a few before and then learn from them and then just rehearsing your kind of answers.
Mm-hmm.
It's important that you don't actually sound really rehearsed though,
Yeah.
because we can quickly find out if you're really rehearsed. And then
Yeah.
then you get to the more robotic kind of feel and then it's not
Yeah.
as personal during the discussion itself.
Yeah. Someone asked, what was the hardest question that you got during your interviews in any of them, if you can remember?
Yeah, I think I got a question about food allergies one time, and so this is actually funny because it brings back MMI, so multiple mini
Mm-hmm.
interviews. So
Mm-hmm.
those are harder questions because they tend to
Yeah.
be on the spot. So you read a
Mm-hmm.
prompt. There's like 7 rooms. You enter the door. You just read the prompt, and you have to discuss about it. I remember it's something about being the legalities of food allergy restrictions. I was really out of my
Mm-hmm.
realm in terms of the legal world. So I was just like, am I speaking with a lawyer? Like, who am I speaking with here? But it ended up being a pretty good discussion still. But these are the things that you just kind of put on the fly, and then hopefully you kind of get through the
Yeah.
interview. So,
Yeah, so you were scouting for like questions that medical schools potentially ask during interviews. And yeah, there's those usual interview questions. And from one pre-med forum, one of the questions were like, how am I gonna think of this on the spot, stuff like that. So those are scary. And I've been hearing about MMIs, how much more difficult they are given the on the spot nature of questions.
yeah, yeah. I remember when I was starting to prepare for my interviews, I remember like some, pre-med forums, they're very, very extra in their advice and very extra in how they proceed.
I wanted to ask you about SDN and Reddit.
Yeah, I'll definitely get to those. But I remember
Yeah.
when I was reading up for my interviews, they were like, "Oh, you should read like the Wall Street Journal, like all these health articles, just to be
Mm-hmm.
familiar with like." No, I think at that time Obama's new kind of healthcare policies were coming out. That's kind of
Mm.
dating myself now, but just being kind of familiar, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, like I haven't read Wall Street Journal for like 3 months. Like I'm gonna be screwed."
Yeah.
But it's good to just get a kind of background knowledge on new healthcare reforms and new policies coming forward,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
just getting familiar with a few MMI prompts and just practicing it.
Mm-hmm.
It does take some practice after some time, but I think it's nice because your personality does tend to come through a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I will say that it's important to be who you are during these
Mm-hmm.
interviews, but also try to be a little bit more extroverted.
Yeah.
So for those that are a little bit more introverted, we like to just talk and just get to know your
Yeah.
thought process. And so, don't sell yourself short, and try to
Yeah.
be enthusiastic.
Also mentioned earlier that the whole pre-med journey was kind of also difficult because of the competition, right? And I'm gonna link this to Student Doctor Network, SDN, for those who don't know. One of the most toxic places on this earth, and what they say in in those forums. Is there some truth to what they say, or it's just pure? You can't get in if you don't have a 4.0 GPA or a 98 percentile on the MCAT.
Yeah, that's literally one of the most terrible places I think to ruin your self-esteem.
Oh
And
my
I think that
gosh.
I think that the saying goes is like comparison is the biggest thief of joy.
Mm.
And it's really important because like there's one particular subreddit on, or like a Reddit, a little post on SDN. It's just like, what are my chances? And that's what you're describing. Like the
Mm-hmm.
applicants who come in with the 4.0 and the perfect MCAT and everything else,
Yeah.
and they get into any single school. But just realizing that a lot of those things on the internet, like it's anonymous, so a lot of those things are
Yeah.
fake. A lot of those things tend to be
Yeah.
fake. And having gone through the entire process, like you don't need to be the best applicant or be
Mm-hmm.
perfect to get into medical school.
Mm-hmm.
Plenty of people get in with stats that aren't as high as that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these averages that we see for medical school, the GPA averages are just averages. People
Yeah.
get in underneath those scores,
Yeah.
people get in above those
Yeah.
scores. So taking that into account, I will say that some of the information is okay, like a
Mm-hmm.
personal statement,
Mm-hmm.
recommendations. These are
Yeah.
general tips and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But once you get into the realm of comparing yourself to another, that's really when you start to down spiral. And I would advise any pre-med student when they realize that, just to remember that it's going to be okay in the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
This
And just run
person is
away from
posting.
SDN. Yeah. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone even asked Dr. Ben, do I need a 4.0 GPA to get into medical school? Will I get in even if I get a C in one class?
And I think that's completely okay. I mean, like
Yeah.
people get in, we care about trends. And so like
Yeah.
as doctors, we care about data a lot. We care about
Yeah.
trends. So like if there's a repeated trend of going downtrending, like you started off as
Mm-hmm.
A's and you're suddenly going
Mm-hmm.
down to C's, D's, F's, then we
Mm-hmm.
start to be concerned. But if you're
Mm-hmm.
going the opposite way and you're going into A's,
Yeah.
B, C, or going
Yeah.
D's, F's, and then up to A's, then we're
Yeah.
starting to think that it's much better. So just getting one spurious or one bad grade isn't going to end your
Yay, great news, everybody.
pre-med.
And moving on from the least toxic part of the conversation, medical school, how do you decide which medical school you want to go to? I know, of course, they always say apply to as many as you can. All you need is that one acceptance. But for you personally, how do you decide that these are the schools I wanted to get into? Is there like a criteria you look for in a medical school or that people should look out for?
Yeah, so when I first was applying, I felt like I was more in the former kind of category. Like, I just need one school, so I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
cast a really, really wide net.
Mm-hmm.
I did think of the caveat, like, if I actually got accepted to the school, would I go based off of many factors? So the main factors I looked for in a medical school was, first of all, was a pass fail. This
Mm-hmm.
seemed like a trivial thing to me, and people kept on telling me to go to pass fail school. But I didn't realize the importance until after or during medical school
Mm-hmm.
because it really takes a big weight off your shoulders. You don't have to deal with the competition. People
Yeah.
are like cutthroat. People are actually collaborative. Like my school we worked together to all learn, which sounds
Right.
cliche, but it was
Yeah.
really a big difference compared to
Yeah.
the rest of it.
Yeah.
The other two major criteria I looked at was whether or not they had research. So in a field that I liked, for example, infectious disease. Not necessarily that you need to do that type of research when you go to that institution, but whether or not there's just a strong research foundation. And I thought that was important to me. And then the first, and I forgot to mention this, the first most actually important thing was geographic location. So, do I want to live in a rural area, a suburban area, an urban area? And I wanted some place that was close to family. So closer to Virginia was really good for me. That was one of the main things I looked at. And then last but certainly not least, I always really care for patient diversity. So like, what is the patient population there? How early can I get involved in patient care? If the med school is only getting you involved during your third year, you're kind of really missing out on the first 2 years and getting your feet wet. And so it's really important to look into these kind of things. But everyone's opinions are going to be very different on what they care for in medical school. But I tend to think about geographic location to be very heavily weighted for many people.
I think also it has to do with, for most people, like in-state tuition as well. Because out-of-state tuition is actually a lot higher.
It is
And then you add in
definitely
the whole price of medical school as a whole.
Yeah, I will say that there are some schools that historically only take in-state students. And this can be very easily found, like the MSAR, which is the tool to look at medical schools. So it's important before you apply, before you waste your money and find out that they only take in-state students, to at least do your due diligence.
It's not cheap to apply to one school.
It's definitely not cheap, yeah.
And medical school. So you've said before that you found medical school much easier than undergrad. Why is that? It sounds so hopeful. It sounds so exciting.
So like I said, when I was in undergrad, I felt like I was just checking boxes. I was doing things that I really didn't like at that time, per se. I didn't want to go to the stock room every single day and restock the supplies in the surgically closet. But once you get into medical school, like, you don't have to do any of that anymore. You don't have to do anything they don't really like anymore, except for study, which I hope that people like. But, so like those research opportunities that you're really trying hard to get in undergrad are suddenly much easier now as a med student. They know that you're a med student, they know that you're doing well, so they kind of throw research projects at you. They're like, oh, you're a med student, like, here, get on this project with us. So those are easier. And then, like I mentioned, I went to a pass-fail school, which was amazing. So I was able to not focus as much on my academics. Not to say that, I didn't do my due diligence and study, but I wasn't super stressed about it. Yeah, I was not stressed about it. One of the biggest things I tell people about medical school and about the pre-med career and the life is that just because you're pre-med or just because you're in medical school doesn't mean that your life needs to be on pause. You don't need to just hold the rest of your life and just say, I'm not going to do this until I'm graduated. I'm not going to do this until I'm a doctor. Like, that mindset and that delayed self-gratification, like, it's just not great. So whenever I was in med school, I had a friend that came, or a group of friends that came to New York, and I was down in Virginia, and they're like, hey, can you come next weekend? And I was just like, well, I have an exam the next week. And I was like, you know what? Like, screw this. Like,
let's do it. Screw it.
I'm a med student. Like, I could do this. So, like, I just made my Anki cards. I sat on a bus for 4 hours to New York, studying super hard. And I hung out with them, and that was, like, honestly one of the best experiences. And I came back, and I took my exam, and I did okay. So really make sure that you continue your life despite being in school.
Amazing. So we had a guest a month ago, Dr. Calvinson, and he traveled to 150 countries during his whole medical school and residency period. And it just goes to show that you can really, time management, balancing as well.
I think that's a really big part of it. It's really hard to learn in the beginning, and you have to figure out what's important to you, how well you can study.
And speaking of studying, we see medical students on YouTube all the time vlogging themselves studying for hours and hours and hours. I guess given the amount of information you have to know, obviously, as a physician, also for all of the board exams, what is medicine without exams, right? Can you take us to what one day would look like when you were a medical student? Was it like really just purely studying, sitting down for hours and hours on end?
I'm not gonna lie, some of those videos are pretty accurate when they're sitting there for like 12 hours. I'm not gonna lie, some of my days are like that. It really depends on how your school is really organized and how it's kind of structured. So for me, I was able to do mostly online kind of remote learning, so I didn't really actually have to go to class. Some people were class goers, and I think that's really, really great for them. I used to watch lectures on 2x speed. I got very used to that. So we used to have lectures we used to have lectures from 8 a.m. to 12, and so every single day. So I would watch those 4 hour lectures of only 2 hours during the day. So I would do that every single morning. I'd wake up at 8, go to the library, and then start studying, and then typically watch those lectures. I do my Anki cards in the morning as well. So I typically was in the library anywhere from like 8 to like 5 p.m., sometimes even 8 p.m. And you do study a lot sometimes during those times.
Yeah.
That was my
12 hour
way of
shift.
studying. Yeah, it's like a 12-hour shift. I think that one of the best advice I got was like treat it just like a 9 to 5 job. Mine was a little bit longer in some days, but like you are just working.
Overtime.
Yeah, which we're not getting paid for. We're paying them.
Yeah.
But treat it like a 9 to 5 job and really find the work-life balance.
Yeah.
I found that I really enjoyed working out in the afternoon because it gave me some time to decompress and get away from the books and stuff like that. And so I would do that like 3 times a week, for example. But a lot of the days was studying from anywhere from like 8 to 12 hours sometimes, Monday through Friday. I will say that people had different approaches, and some people studied only for like, 5 hours a day. So it's really what you put into it.
It's a full-time job, basically, to be a med student.
Yeah, it's probably a full-time job plus extra sometimes.
An extra.
But you can leave. That was mostly how first 2 years of med school go.
Yeah.
And then we could talk about clerkships in fourth year and how that's different.
Someone's asking, how does Anki work?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a good question. So Anki is a computer program, or that you can also get on your phone. Anki is a flashcard system. You are able to make your own flashcards, download other people's flashcards. It's a great sharing community, and it's different in two aspects. In that the flashcard nature makes it have active learning. So if you're just reading a paragraph and highlighting it over and over again, it really is just a passive learning system. It really doesn't work that well. But doing the active learning is great. And then the second part, the biggest key, is probably the spaced repetition. So this is a way that they're able to tell, and that you can indicate to the computer. If you get a card and you say, I really know this information really well, you press that button, they're going to show it to you at a later date. As opposed to if you get that question wrong, they show it to you earlier. And so the whole premise is that you're in theory doing this card pretty frequently in this deck, so that the computer program can basically indicate to yourself, rather than you doing it, that, hey, you need to review this information more.
And I bet you use Anki too also for like all of your step exams, right?
Yeah, so I did use it for step exams. But the biggest and most important thing, so going back a little bit, the step exams, for students who aren't familiar with it, there's 3 steps. Step 1 is typically the step that you take, during the first or second year of med school, sometimes in the third and fourth now. They used to determine what kind of specialty you could go into, which is soul crushing. If you want to become a neurosurgeon, you're really gung ho. You come into med school, you do really great in med school, then you take this exam, and you realize that the score isn't competitive enough, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble because it's kind of hard to get into that specialty, which is unfortunate because it's so competitive. So there's 3 steps. Step 1 used to be the most important. It's now pass fail, so we'll see what comes out of that. But back when it was graded for us, we used to do a lot of Anki, or at least I did. And I used a lot of UWorld because it's all about seeing the different types of questions. How can they present this information differently? Obviously, very similar to like the MCAT, we would do content review in the beginning, or for however they structured it. So to review every single organ system, GI, cards, endocrine, all of those things.
Nothing much.
Every literally from head to everywhere from head to toe from the human body. You have to learn almost everything. You don't have to memorize every single bone, but there's a few bones that you should definitely know. And then doing those practice questions, and then finally taking the exam, which is anywhere from like a 12 to 14-hour exam. I don't know how long it is nowadays.
Can you talk about the contents of the different step exams, and which one do you think was the hardest of the 3?
Sure, yeah. So it gets a little bit easier as time goes on between step 1 and step 3, which is good. The first step covers every single organ system, but it covers a lot of minutia that isn't really clinically appropriate or clinically applicable. So it's really the things that we'd be learning in a textbook. In step 1, they cover, as I mentioned, the GI system, cardiology, neurology, endocrine, all of the other organ systems. And the questions are hard because they're not any more longer like, oh, he has disease X. What is the treatment for that disease? They're like 3rd level questions now. They're like, he has disease X. What is the side effect of the medication you would treat him with? And then you're like, well, I don't even know what medication I would treat him with. How am I going to know the side effect? So the questions get a little bit harder. The content's still there, and the variety of different ways they can ask a question is pretty much covered in the world.
Mhm.
or any others kind of question bank that are widely available.
Crazy. And it's just, I feel like so nerve-wracking to think about how much content you really need to know. It all makes sense. You're going to be taking care of people's lives directly. You're making all the executive decisions over the patient's condition and their plan of care. So it really does make sense the amount of studying a physician needs to do. You mentioned clerkship earlier, but prior to clerkship, which starts in the third year, if
Typically, yeah.
I'm correct. What are the classes that you actually take during the first 2 years?
Yeah, so these are going to depend on whether or not you're doing actually in-class lectures or the sort of like that. But
Mm.
they're typically like, professor stands up at the table or stands up at the front of the classroom giving a lecture. There's been this new movement towards moving towards a reversed or kind of flipped table learning, which
Mm.
is you learn all the material before class, you study the PowerPoint, and then you come in and you
Mhm.
just ask the questions. So for us,
Mm.
we did a little bit of combination of that. We had a
Mhm.
lot of also like team-based learning, what we call TBLs,
Mhm.
group-based learning.
Mhm.
So it's kind of you
Mhm.
come in, you work with a group to work through an example medical case because it's
Mhm.
great because we're not just always going to be treating patients and listening to lectures. We're going to actually be treating patients in a clinical
Yeah.
scenario. So having that kind of simulated cases are really nice. And then going alongside that, outside of the classroom, we also have like a clinical skills kind of class in which you're learning
Mhm.
actually how to like auscultate the heart, how to
Mhm.
do the physical exam, because those are
Mhm.
things that are not just taught in the classroom. They're actually
Mhm.
taught more so in this clinical skills, which is still classroom, but
Mhm.
then eventually you go on to clerkships.
How were clerkships? Your rotations. Was it scary? Like you see things on YouTube or TikTok jokes of actual attendings and surgeons yelling at med students during their rotations. Do
Yeah.
those things actually happen?
Unfortunately, sometimes they do. Whether or not the resident or the attendings or some sort of hospital staff is not having a great day, sometimes the medical
Mm.
student does get some scolding, as we'll say, which is really
Mhm.
unfortunate because we try to avoid those sort of
Yeah.
circumstances. And never should a medical student feel like they're
Yeah.
being targeted in any sort of way. But I will say that clerkships they're fun because you're no longer just sitting in a classroom. You're actually going to go see a
Mhm.
patient. They have that heart condition that you thought was super rare,
Mhm.
and now you're taking care of them. I will say it's very different though, because now this is actually a 9 to 5 job, or sometimes
Mhm.
9 to 9 job, depending on how rotation you're on.
Mhm.
But you're no
Yeah.
longer in charge of your own schedule. If your
Yeah.
attending says be here at 4 a.m. tomorrow,
Mhm.
you got to be there sometimes at 3:30 to prep for your
Oh,
patients in the morning. So it's no longer your schedule. So that's different. But it's really nice
yeah.
to be able to actually treat patients, see patients. It is hard though, because not only are you seeing them and working that 9 to 5 job, you're also studying when you come back because you have
Mm.
exams. The exams never end. I just
Oh,
took an exam like a few months ago, so they never end.
oh
And so
my.
yeah, the exams never end, but you get used to it, and it's pretty fun in the end because it's much better than sitting in a classroom all day.
And you rotate to every specialty, right? Within the
Yeah,
hospital, or is there also outpatient opportunities as well?
yeah. So that's a great question. So rotations at its core were supposed to be meant to allow students to get a general basis of what it's like to be
Mm.
a doctor in multiple
Mhm.
fields, and it's also a really good time for students to explore what kind of medical field they want to do based
Mhm.
off of exposure to that field. So
Mhm.
even if you weren't really interested in psychiatry, or for example, and then you come
Mhm.
in, you rotate through psych because it is one of the core requirements, and you end up
Mhm.
loving it. Like that's great that you're
Mhm.
able to have that experience. But we
Yeah.
rotate through a variety. General surgery is very common, internal
Mhm.
medicine, neurology,
Mhm.
psychiatry, family medicine, and
Mhm.
OB-GYN and peds. So
Mhm.
those tend to be the core ones. And then you
Mhm.
can fill in with whatever other electives you'd like to do, like ophthalmology,
Okay.
anesthesia,
Mm.
dermatology. These are kind of a little bit less heard of fields because they're not as
Mhm.
common, but really good
Mhm.
to get that sort of exposure in medical school when you're doing
Yeah.
rotation.
Was there one that you liked the most? Well, I guess given dermatology since.
Yeah. So actually, when I first came into medical school, I thought I wanted to do orthopedics because I was an orthopedics
Oh
grad,
wow.
or versus
Yeah,
surgery.
yeah,
Both
yeah.
of which are very difficult to get into and difficult lifestyles. But
Mhm.
ultimately, I really liked plastic surgery and dermatology. Plastic surgery is really creative. There's so many different things that you could do. You could take a lot of different approaches to fix like an area, and you could
Mhm.
help with like reconstructions after like breast
Yeah,
mastectomies. It's really
yeah.
rewarding work. So I really liked that experience, and then obviously dermatology was my ultimate choice. But I really liked plastic surgery overall.
Yeah, Dr. Sugai always tells me that dermatology is an art form, which I agree, which I agree. And then fast forward to choosing your specialty. Can you tell us what's the process of that? Is there like one day that you make, oh, this day I will decide that I want to apply for residency? And can you apply to different specialties at the same time? How does the whole process work?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the process of deciding what kind of medical specialty you want to do is really, it takes almost a full 3 years to be able to really decide, because you have to do your steps, make sure that you're competitive for your application to that specialty. And then you really don't start deciding until third year, because that's really when you start getting your hands dirty and, getting your feet wet. Even if you really wanted to do, family medicine and then you finally fell in love with a different specialty during third year, that's really when we start to decide is third year. You don't ultimately really need to decide until the beginning of fourth year, and some people aren't even decided then, and they do dual apply, as we say. But it's important because that's when you start thinking about what kind of letters do I need? What kind of experiences do I need to make a competitive applicant? What kind of research? So typically people decide during their fourth years, and then they can dual apply. We apply through a system called the match, which is, it used to be that students would apply to a lot of different schools, and then the program director would just select that applicant. What ended up happening in the past was that some students had connections to that school, and it made the process really unfair. So now we go through the program called the match, in which you apply to a variety of different programs, and then this computer algorithm comes along and says, hey, this school you like to here, you like them, you rank them, fourth, or they ranked you first, and then the computer program would take all the applicants across the entire nation and say, this is the best outcome for everybody to satisfy everyone. And it's a very nerve-wracking process, the match.
Sounds like the Hunger Games for some reason.
It kind of does, honestly. Our fate is decided by this one computer.
Yeah, it's like Divergent. I know, right? Okay, that is nerve-wracking. And your specialty is dermatology, right? We're looking at a future dermatologist here. And for those who don't know, dermatology is one of the most competitive specialties out there, along with neurosurgery and I believe ophthalmology as well, and orthopedics as well, which means his step one score was really great. Are you excited for all of this? I mean, I guess it's also tiring being an intern right now. And if you could also explain what PGY1 means, what's the difference between interns versus residents?
Yeah, first of all, I am very excited because I go back to the derm world. But the PGY1 is typically, so that means postgraduate year training number one. So it just indicates how many years you are outside of medical school. For anybody who's going to dermatology, this requires us to do a preliminary year or some sort of transitional year in between that. So I'm doing mine in internal medicine, for example. And the theory, and I think the most important thing about it, is that can you be a good doctor to understand the entire body before just specializing on skin? And so that's what I'm currently doing. I'm in ICUs, I'm in the ED, I'm on the general medicine wards, treating a variety of different pathologies and diseases before going into derm. And then after that, we do 3 years of dermatology in which we learn how to become a dermatologist and study everything about the skin. Unfortunately, it's one of the more competitive specialties, but I think it's definitely worth it. And I'm excited to go back and just be focusing on skin sometimes. I don't want to listen to the heart. I'm very
for sure. I know. Ouch. How is it being an intern? So I do work in the hospital as a nurse, and July 1st, new residents, new interns coming in. Obviously, they're nervous, they're scared, it's their first time, and they're doctors. There is one TikTok I wanna mention it where someone's like, oh, I was with a patient earlier and they were looking for the doctor. And the nurses were like, oh, good thing the doctor is here. And then the intern was like, oh, where's the doctor? And it's like, oh, wait, I am the doctor. Oh, crap. So is that feeling the same your first few weeks, I guess, being an intern?
Yeah, definitely. It's weird because I feel like throughout medical school, we're never called doctor. We're called student doctor, medical student.
Yeah.
Calling yourself
Yeah.
doctor is very difficult to do when you're at that point. But then suddenly when, hospital staff, nurses, pharmacists are looking at you and saying doctor, you're like, wow, there must be a doctor really close by. Like, I don't know who
I know. Wait, it's me.
it's like, doctor, what are your orders? It's like, I don't know. let me check the book.
Anything you want.
But it's really overwhelming in the beginning, particularly since patients are looking for you for their advice. They're trusting you because they're almost their lives, and then so you start to feel a lot of pressure. But it's really important to think about what have I gone through to gone to this point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've done so much schooling, I've done so much education.
Mm-hmm.
People have written letters, so people have faith in me. I should have more confidence in
Mm-hmm.
myself, and so you get used to the pretty quickly. And as you
Yeah.
know, nurses are really great. And so whenever I have questions, I just go to the nurses. I'm just like, please help, and they and they
Yeah, but
yeah.
I understand. The same for everyone, especially in the health professional field. It's like you go out into the field really not knowing anything because you learn on the job,
Yeah.
basically. And how are the hours? This is a thing that's circulating amongst pre-meds as well, is the amount of hours residents have to work within 1 week, especially for internal medicine.
Yeah, so it varies drastically across the different rotations. So even within when we're on with residencies, we do different
Mm-hmm.
rotations. In the ICU during like peak COVID times, it was pretty
Mm-hmm.
frequent to be able to work like 60 to 80 hours. Technically, our cap is 80 hours a week. So we work normally 6 days a week. So that's anywhere from
Mm-hmm.
12 to 13 hours per
Mm-hmm.
day times 6 days, and you would get up to this the 80.
Mm-hmm.
The funny thing is that the requirement or the cap of 80 hours per week is across like a different time span. So it's not just 1 week. It's like across 4 weeks, so a month. If you worked at
Mm-hmm.
least less than 80. So you can work 100 hours on 1 week, then work a little bit less, but it still averages out to be less than 80. I would say that would be pretty extreme. For me personally, I would work, as I mentioned, 60 to 80 hours in the ICU.
Mm-hmm.
On the general medicine floors, we work anywhere from 60 to 70. So it's pretty common to work that many hours a week. And then it
Are you
varies
tired?
across specialty. Yeah, I mean, you get used to it, as I mentioned, but it depends on the specialty. Neurosurgery, it's very
Mm-hmm.
common for them to
Mm-hmm.
work greater than 80
Mm-hmm.
hours. Often plastic surgery, probably likely the same. Dermatology, probably a little bit different because we mostly do 9 to 5s on clinic days, but
The
we do,
goals.
yeah, we do study a lot, so it's not just
Yeah.
working
Mm-hmm.
weeks that everyone is joking about. But residency can be tough in terms of the hours.
Yeah,
And it's
for
important
sure.
to have a good like support system, whether it be
For
family,
sure.
friends, significant others, vice versa, or etc.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what a lot of people, even within the hospital, like even, I don't know, senior nurses or other, I think they don't understand about residents is that they're taking care of a lot of patients. Like
Yeah.
technically the whole floor, or if it's a small hospital, it's the whole hospital. It's like you're learning at the same time, you know? So applause to you. You're
Thank you.
doing
Thank you.
great.
And I will say that, when we were talking about, being called a doctor, it's not just
Mm-hmm.
putting in the order suddenly. And it's
Yeah.
not just the physical toll that
Mm-hmm.
residents take, but it's really the emotional toll sometimes.
Yeah.
And during, the peak COVID times,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the
Mm-hmm.
most difficult times to be in the ICU
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
patients are passing
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
Families are very, very stressed.
Yeah.
Everyone tends to be very stressed, even the
Mm-hmm.
physicians. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when I was in the ICU, it wasn't infrequent that I declared a patient dead.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that,
Mm-hmm.
it's a really scary responsibility when you first begin. You have to go,
Mm-hmm.
you have to be that person that comes into the room, listens to the heart,
Mm-hmm.
examines the patient and turns to their
Mm-hmm.
family and their loved ones and say, I'm sorry that your loved one passed
Yeah.
away. So that responsibility can take a large toll on a person's
Yeah. For
mentality, mental
sure.
health, and emotional well-being. But personally, for me, I felt that I've been really supported in my growth as a physician
Mm,
and really supported by all my friends. And that's really
I'm
what's been
glad.
helping me get through that.
I'm glad. And actually, that's one thing that a lot of people are also asking the questions where how is that social life balance? Even now in residency or even during medical school, do you still get time to go out, like even as a resident working these crazy hours?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm personally very extroverted. And so, like,
Mm,
I really drive or take a lot of energy from meeting other people and
mhm.
working and hanging out
Yeah.
with my friends. And so,
Mm,
any incident or any event that I can hang out with my friends, I
mhm.
always try to make use of as much as possible. I think it's really fun. And honestly, it's without my coworkers, I feel like I'd have a much more harder time. But whenever
Yeah.
we get off of work early, we always try to hang out, go to the park. San Francisco is really big on the park life and being able to enjoy the nice weather
Yeah.
because it's only 60 degrees
Or
here.
go to those delicious Korean barbecues that I've been
Oh yeah.
seeing.
Oh yeah, yeah. Those are really good spots too. And so it's
Yeah.
nice to be able to hang out. And as I mentioned
Yeah.
before, just because you're in medical
Mhm.
school, just because you're in residency or pre-med,
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you should have your life on pause. Like, please, I encourage people to have their friends hang out with them
Yeah.
and to do whatever else they like in their life.
Yeah. Another big question, of course, let's talk about the elephant in the room. All these years is the money. the
Sure.
tuition, the loans. I think the average is around 200 to
Yeah.
$300,000 by the time someone finishes medical school. That doesn't go untouched. That also comes up with interest. Were you ever intimidated by that big amount of money? Or speaking for those who probably like don't have their parents helping them or whatnot, or just loaning it completely?
I think it's really unfortunate that our medical education system has
Mm-hmm.
come with such a big price tag for those who like science and want to help people, and now they're
Yeah.
suddenly paying upwards of
Mm-hmm.
200 to
Mm-hmm.
$300,000. Personally, for me, that wasn't as big of a concern.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I would be able to, pay it off
Mm-hmm.
eventually, regardless of whatever specialty I chose.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that for some, unfortunately, they have to consider that whenever they decide on a specialty,
Yeah.
which is really unfortunate because, they're either seeking a higher compensated specialty that they don't like as
Mm-hmm.
much, or they're
Mm-hmm.
seeking a program that has a lower requirement of duration of residency so
Mm-hmm.
they can start
Yeah.
paying that. It's really unfortunate that that's the case. But I will say that there's, opportunities and scholarships certainly available.
Mm-hmm.
There's the military options, which a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
colleagues decided as
Mm-hmm.
well, in which they for your entire medical school, and then you don't have any loans whatsoever. And they actually pay
Mm-hmm.
you during medical school. So you're actually making some
Mm-hmm.
money. So those are opportunities that people could look into. There's one that is recently caught a lot of media, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, PSLF. So if you make loan payments and you work at a nonprofit hospital, which almost all academic centers, so all of them that are during your
Mm-hmm.
residency, if you work for that hospital or those type of hospitals for 10 years, then they'll just forgive your loan. And so that $200,000 to $300,000 loan could suddenly become zero after 10 years. But there's some strict requirements, and they got some bad press
Mm-hmm.
recently that many people who
Mm-hmm.
applied for that didn't even get approval. So I think that
Yeah.
could be looked at, but make
Yeah.
sure you're doing it correctly.
Well,
Yeah.
that gives a lot of hope to those who are worried about such a big amount of money. And like you said, it's quite sad that for the next generation of people who will service the healers, the nation have to pay such amount of money to
Yeah.
to reach that position. Given that you've probably spent what 8 years of college and doctorate school in total, and working crazy hours and still going through residency. Do you feel like you missed anything in life, and are there any regrets of pursuing medicine?
Yeah, that's a hard question, honestly. If you asked me in the beginning of med school, I probably would say yes, please send me back to Asia so I can enjoy my time there instead.
Yeah.
But honestly, having gone through it, it's a hard journey because, as I
Mm-hmm.
said, comparison is the thief of joy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like it's easy for us to be comparing ourselves to people who are not in medicine, who are in tech,
Yeah.
business, or they're investment
Mm-hmm.
bankers, and these tend to
Mm-hmm.
be high earning without nearly as much
Mm-hmm.
burnout and as
Mm-hmm.
much stress that healthcare
Mm-hmm.
professionals do
Yeah.
face. Personally, for me, I have no regrets. I'm very happy with my choice. And not only that, I'm happy because I found out that I don't only have to do medicine. I
Yeah.
could do medicine part time if I wanted. I could do it full
Mm-hmm.
time, or I could do it as
Mm-hmm.
much as I want. I could
Mm-hmm.
do teledermatology, so I don't
Mm-hmm.
actually have to go into the clinic. So
Yeah.
it really allows me to give that work-life balance because I have many
Mm-hmm.
other passions outside of medicine,
Yeah.
tech, industry, entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
all of those things. And so ultimately it's finding what kind of physician you want to be and how can
Mm-hmm.
that practice and what kind of future can you have in that career that
Mm-hmm.
makes you the happiest outside of the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of people are starting to realize that if you're not happy outside of the
Mm-hmm.
hospital, how are you going to be happy inside of the hospital, whether or not you're working in the hospital? But it's
Yeah.
important to think about whenever you're moving forward in a career in
Mm-hmm.
medicine. And I will say this, not to scare anybody, but definitely make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons
Yeah.
and do some self-critical analysis
Yeah.
and thinking about what are my other options? Would I be happy doing something else that's not
Mm-hmm.
medicine, or would I be only
Mm-hmm.
wanting to do medicine? Take some time to think about that.
Yeah, because it's a long road.
It is a long,
it's
long
a it's
road.
a long road to go in for the wrong reasons,
You'll be
right?
thinking very hard every single
Yeah,
day.
every single day. Yeah, I can imagine. It's like I should have not. I should have not. And this sounds like an interview question, but where do you see yourself in 5 years or 10 years? Like you were saying, there is also a life outside medicine. You do this part-time, full-time. What do you see yourself doing within those time frames?
Yeah, so anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Luckily, I'll be graduated from residency, so I don't have to deal with that anymore. But I would really be excited to do part-time dermatology, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or a full-time with a lot more teledermatology, so I can either work from
Mm-hmm.
home or have a
Mm-hmm.
better work-life balance. But I
Mm-hmm.
want to spend a lot of my time figuring out how can I impact people outside of the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I realized when I was in medical school is that, like, sure, as a doctor, I could see upwards to 60 patients in a day, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
capped at being able to help 60 patients in one day. What can I do outside the hospital, whether it's making a product, making a company,
Mm-hmm.
making a service to help more than that, to help like
Mm-hmm.
thousands of people every single day. So I'm really interested in like consulting for
Mm-hmm.
healthcare or to like help nonprofits start like
Yeah.
cancer centers or
Yeah.
hospitals in other countries, which I've been
Yeah.
helping, and then also to make do something in entrepreneurship. I think that these are
Mm-hmm.
really fun things that make me excited and kind of make me remember that I'm treating these patients, but I'm doing something even bigger sometimes,
Yeah.
different scale.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And I'm excited for you.
yeah, thank you, appreciate it.
Is there any one piece of any advice that you would give to a student or anyone who's deep down their hearts that they want to pursue medicine? If there's one thing you want to tell them, what would that be?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is to just do it. And you know, it's going to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing in this life is easy. If it was, then everyone else would do it. But after taking that critical time to reflect on whether or not you want this career, I would say just do it. You know, do your research, figure out what can I do now to become a doctor in 5 to 10 years, and you know, who do I need to know? Who can I reach out to? And don't do it alone. Think about the whole system of network that could support that you have. Don't reach out
Mm-hmm.
to SDN probably. It's probably not going to be your best bet. Go ahead.
No,
But
not sitting
friends,
doctor.
family, you know, who
Yeah.
do they know who's gone through the process and hear them, like listen to them, get their
Mm-hmm.
advice, and then just go for it. And then know and have confidence in yourself that you can make it. And persistence
Yeah.
is key.
Yeah. Baseline, no SDN, everybody.
Yes, yes. I think that's well established.
Yeah, no, in the beginning, I was like, someone told me about SDN, so I started looking into it. So, you have questions in mind. The longer I go into the next page, into the third page, I'm like, wow, there is no chance whatsoever. There is no hope whatsoever. It is
Yeah.
it's like a chasm in that place.
It is
I
really
know.
difficult, honestly. It's that place should be banned for most
I
pre-meds,
know,
but
right? I know, right? From pre-med students, I
yeah,
know.
but it has some uses, so it is what it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, Dr. Chan, thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight.
Of
I
course.
know when we were talking about this, you're like, oh, you get up at 4 p.m. And I was like, are you free 5 p.m.? I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm giving him 1 hour to rest in between.
No,
But
no worries, no worries.
but thank you,
Happy to
thank you
join.
so much for being with us tonight. I know you've been
Thanks so much.
awake for
I'm
too
gonna
long.
eat first, but then I'll get some sleep.
Yeah, go eat first and then get some sleep.
All right, thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much. Thank you.